Good afternoon to everyone, distinguished delegates and colleagues, both here in the room in Rome and those who have joined us online. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this side event on transforming agri-food systems through gender equality and women's empowerment. I am Brenda Behan. I'm the Director of Gender Equality at the World Food Programme. So I'm delighted to be here with you. The Coalition on Making Food Systems Work for Women and Girls is sponsoring this side event. We have an excellent panel of distinguished members here to talk to you a little bit about initiatives and reports that relate to this topic. So on behalf of the coalition, I'd like to introduce our panel members. We first have Dr. Lauren Phillips, an international political economist and the Deputy Director of the Inclusive Rural Transformation and Gender Equality Division here at FAO. We have Dr. Jemima Njuki, who is an expert on gender and food systems and the Chief of the Economic Empowerment Section at UN Women. And also here in person, Ms. Mia Beers, who's a strategic leader in resilience and food security in both humanitarian and development settings. And she is the Deputy Assistant Administrator at USAID's Bureau of Humanitarian Affairs. And she also serves as the USAID Resilience Coordinator. Online, I'd like to welcome Ms. Rima Nanavanti, who's an experienced leader and the General Secretary of the Self-Employed Women's Association of India, which is the largest union of informal workers and with a membership of over 1.7 million. So we have a pretty tight timetable, and I have the unfortunate task of being also the timekeeper here. So we will go quickly in order to perhaps have some time for question and answers directly to our panel. And I will start off with Lauren to talk to us about the report that FAO has recently released on the status of women in agri-food systems. Over to you, Lauren.
Thank you so much, Brenda, for the introduction. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to present today a report that FAO published in April, and some of you have been involved and listened in to launches that we've been doing across the world on the status of women in agri-food systems. It's not a product of the coalition, but it sort of helps us to frame and understand the role of women in agri-food systems and what some of the challenges they're facing are in participating fully and being fully employed in agri-food systems. So I would like to start by saying that the report, which we will sort of put in the chat and make available to everyone, takes a comprehensive and global view of the role that women play in all parts of agri-food systems, from on-farm production to off-farm processing, packaging, marketing, and sales, and really reflects an evolution in our thinking from a focus on gaps in gender to thinking about how we can encourage gender transformative change. It places gender equality and women's empowerment at the center of the report because it's important in and of itself, but also because we think that it's very key for transforming and improving welfare in agri-food systems. So the starting data point is that more than a third of women working globally are working in agri-food systems, 36%, along with 38% of working men. And that's a slight decrease from 2005 because the number of women working in primary agricultural production, as you can see in the graph, has dropped for both men and women between 2005 and 2019. But this sort of global picture of a third of women working in agri-food systems hides the fact that in some countries and some places in the world, agri-food systems are a much greater source of livelihoods for women than for men. And the case of sub-Saharan Africa is notable because in sub-Saharan Africa, 66% of the women who work are working in agri-food systems. And in Southern Asia, so including in India, 71% of working women are working in agri-food systems. Despite the fact that so many women work in agri-food systems and that so many of them rely on agri-food systems for their livelihoods, the report shows that the conditions under which women are working are not equal. So women tend to have irregular or informal work in the sector. They often work in part-time roles, even if they desire to work in full-time employment. And they are sort of segmented into parts of the agri-food system and the value chains which are low-skilled and labor-intensive. For all of those reasons, their work can be characterized as being vulnerable. And that characterization of vulnerability comes from a definition from our colleagues at ILO, which shows that both in agriculture, on farm and off farm, women are working in sort of vulnerable positions. They're much more likely to be working, around half of them, as on family farms without pay, or they're working without salaries and wages being formalized in off-farm work. The sort of other major finding of the report around the conditions of work for women is that there are large gaps in wages between men and women in this sector, and there are large productivity gaps. So due to discrimination, in large part, there is a gap in land productivity between men and women farmers of around 24%, which is driven by a variety of issues, but requires us to compare farms of the similar size. And additionally, there's a wage gap so that women in agri-food systems are making only 82 cents on the dollar. And all of these inequalities are also shaped by the fact that women take up much more unpaid domestic and care work, working 4 times as much in unpaid and domestic care work as men globally, and sometimes much more. A third major finding of our report is that despite the attention that the international community has placed on gender over the past 10, 15, 20 years, there hasn't been much change in women's access to critical assets and services in agriculture, like extension, irrigation, and the ownership of livestock. So I want to focus for a moment on land. Globally, FAO is the custodian for SDG 5.8.1 and 2, which measure the access women have to land. And we found that only 6 countries out of 46 have greater levels of female ownership than male ownership of land. So in the great majority of countries, all of those little dots above the dotted line, women own less land than men. And additionally, in half of countries, the legal protections for women's land rights are either low or very low. All of this is sort of, a bleak picture. There were several positive points or positive progress noted in the report about closing gaps, for example, in finance, access to finance, and access to mobile internet, which is starting to close, so that the remaining gap is around 16%. The report also engages with the ways that norms and policies can constrain women's participation in agri-food systems. It notes that this is at the heart of gender equality and that social norms are very slow to change. So there have not been major improvements in a number of important norms about women's work. For example, in the majority of countries, people believe that children suffer when their mothers work, or wife beating and gender-based violence remains acceptable in many countries, both amongst women and men that are surveyed. And gender-based violence is a major theme of the report because it's an important condition for women who work in agri-food systems and other sectors. Policies, on the other hand, have started to change more quickly than social norms, with 75% of policy documents in agriculture and rural development now mentioning the challenges that women face, but less than 20% have specific objectives which try to address these constraints. And finally, we also investigated women's empowerment and looking at the drivers of women's empowerment, but also its co-benefits. So women's empowerment is critical, but it also has a variety of positive impacts on production, food security, children's nutrition, and dietary diversity. The 5th chapter of our report is really looking at the way that shocks and vulnerabilities in agri-food systems are gendered. And so we looked at COVID-19, at climate change, and at conflict, and we found a variety of striking statistics. For example, 22% of women lost their jobs in off-farm agri-food systems during the first year of the pandemic, compared to only 2% of men. And this is, as I said, is a condition of their vulnerability in their work in agri-food systems. And additionally, there was a major spike in the gap between men and women's food insecurity during the pandemic. So the gap was 1.7 percentage points prior to the pandemic in 2019, and it grew to 4.3 percentage points in 2021. Additionally, climate change has a variety of impacts on women that are different from those on men because of the conditions in which they participate in agri-food systems. But one finding that we wanted to highlight was that during times of heat stress or heat shock, women reduce their working hours in agriculture less than men. They stay in the field and on the farm longer despite the heat. So just to sort of finalize, I'd like to say some major policy highlights from the report and then give you 3 calls to action. So the policy highlights are a mix of different things that we found have worked on either improving gender equality or increasing women's empowerment. So the first is that gender transformative approaches, or approaches that engage with social norms, are both cost effective and can change discriminatory norms at the local level, which is important given the slow changing of norms that I mentioned earlier. The second is that closing gaps in land tenure and increasing women's access to land has a variety of benefits on employment and investment, on their capacity for natural resource management, on women's access to services, on their families' resilience, food security, and on reducing gender-based violence. The third is that a social policy, access to formal childcare, can have a large and positive impact on mothers' employment and high returns in agri-food systems. And social protection, I'm skipping one for now, can increase women's employment and enhance resilience. So these sets of social policies can be packaged to the benefit of women. And finally, group-based approaches are important for increasing empowerment and resilience, as I'm sure our colleagues from SAWA will emphasize when they speak later. In terms of calls to action, the report contains 3. The first is that data has improved. There is increasingly sex disaggregated data available, but in many areas where we went to look for data, like on climate change, there's missing data. And so we still need better data on various topics on this within this field, but also on other dimensions of social and economic differentiation. Like we would like to know more about young women versus older women, or about women from indigenous peoples, etc. The second is that we believe that we need intervention at scale, which help to close those asset and resource gaps that I mentioned, so the wage gap and the productivity gap, because doing so could increase global GDP by 1%, which is around 1/3 of Africa's GDP, and provide food security for 45 million people. And finally, a lot of development interventions in our field in agri-food systems do not try purposefully to empower women. But if they were able to do so, there's a major benefit that could come for all of the reasons I explained. And we believe that interventions that focused on empowerment could increase the incomes of an additional 58 million people above and beyond their expected impacts, and the resilience of an additional 235 million people. I hope I kept more or less the time, Brenda. Thanks so much.
You did an excellent job on timekeeping and really giving us a great overview of the report. I think the dimming of the lights came when we had some of the darker moments, but you also gave us a little bit of hope there too. But thanks very much, and also for really the business case for doing this, and doing this at scale with your call to action. Not that it's just the right thing to do, but it's actually the smart thing for us to be doing. So I'm going to turn now to Jemima, who's going to take us through the Global 50/50 report from 2022. Over to you, Jemima.
Thank you very much, Brenda. And it is such a pleasure for me to be here to present the Global Food 50/50 report findings. And this is really sort of the other side of the coin in terms of looking at food systems organizations, their commitment to gender equality, and what's happening. So the Global Food 50/50 emerged out of the work of the Gender Lever of Change for the UN Food Systems Summit. So we actually launched the first report at the summit in 2021. It monitors progress and holds food system organizations accountable for achieving intersectional gender equality in leadership, in adopting gender equitable internal workplace policies, and implementing strategies that advance progress towards gender just and equitable food systems. So the aim of this report, which is also an accountability mechanism, is really to encourage food system organizations to confront and address gender inequality both within the organization governance structures and in their programmatic approaches. And so it looks at who holds power and influence in the governance of food systems organizations, and presents some rigorous evidence on the inequitable currently, which we hope will change as a result of this accountability mechanism. but really looks at some of the inequitable gender composition of boards, governing global food systems, but also the outsized presence of a really small number of nationalities in these governance bodies or food systems organizations. So the findings are based on 9 indicators, and I'll just show them here and present some of the results from the 2022 report. We are currently preparing the report for 2023 that we will launch in September of this year. So these results are based on 9 indicators that are grouped into 4 categories: the commitment to redistribute power, the gender and geography of global food systems leadership, policies, internal policies to tackle power and privilege imbalances in the workplace, and addressing the gendered power dynamics of inequalities in the outcomes of these food systems organizations. What we see across all organizations is there is very strong public commitment to gender equality. So we see, for example, in 2022, about 61% of organizations actually publicly in their websites, in their public documents, do commit to gender equality for the benefit of all, but still some concerns around organizations really that have no reference to gender equality. And given what Roland has said about the importance of food systems for women and girls, we find that a big concern. Most board seats in these organizations are occupied by nationals of high income countries. So nearly 3 out of 4 seats are held by nationals of high income countries. Just 11 seats across 8 boards are held by nationals of low-income countries. And when we look at the gender composition, we see some of the same patterns. 70% of CEOs and board chairs are men. This is now changing, hasn't changed much across 2021 and 2022. We are hoping to see some changes in 2023, hopefully. But what is really concerning for us is that only 2% of board seats overall are occupied by women from low income countries. So despite the patterns we see in Lauren's report about the really high percentage of working women who are in agri-food systems, that is not distributed across the whole, if you would call it the whole value chain of agri-food systems. We see 1/3 of food systems organizations that do not have publicly available workplace gender equality policies, and about 18%, close to 20%, have a commitment to gender equality, but have no specific measures to address those inequalities. So it's there in paper, in commitment, but really nothing practical that shows that action will be taken. Outwardly, what we are seeing is as we talk more about gender transformative approaches, as we talk more about addressing the structural inequalities in food systems, an increase in organizations that are seeking to implement programmatic approaches that are gender transformative and that address underlying causes of inequalities. But still a couple of organizations that are completely gender blind and do not have any mention of how they are addressing gender inequality in the work that they do. What we do is we also have the performance of individual organizations. We are hoping that through a name and shame, we might also get some organizations to actually improve, but also learn from those that are doing much better in certain areas. So there is a report available that you can have a look at. That's the website for the report, and we will be circulating and launching the 2023 report in September. This work is done by the Global health 50-50. There has been a tracking of the same indicators within the health sector, and this is the component that tracks in food systems organizations in collaboration with the International Food Policy Research Institute and UN Women. So we hope that through this initiative, we can not only produce evidence and monitor progress, but ultimately that we can effect change towards a more gender-just food systems governance landscape within the organizations that are really active in food systems. And we can categorize organizational progress towards gender inequality, fixing some of these institutional and organization systems that really perpetuate inequalities. Thank you.
Thank you, Jemima, for some very important, I think, data points on accountability and power structures. I think really interesting for me to note that there was a little bit of sliding backwards on the overall commitment to gender equality, but quite a bit of a jump forward in terms of the gender transformative approaches that are being supported, and also then linking back to Lauren's comment on how effective and how important those actually are in translating policies then into practice on the ground. But we've heard very clearly that these boards and these power structures do not represent the global workforce in agri-food systems. So that's a very stark reminder. So I hope none of you are from organizations that are in Jemima's little black book here. So. Okay, so let's pass the floor now to Ms. Beers and hear a little bit from her on USAID's GROW initiative. Over to you, Mia.
Great, thank you for the warm welcome, and thank you so much for including the U.S. in this important conversation. So the U.S. Agency for International Development, whether really on the development side, which I represent today, or the humanitarian side, and the entire U.S. government are very much committed to advancing gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls in all their diversity around the world, including and especially in agri-food systems. So I'm very excited to be talking a little bit about some of our initiatives, and partly to implement this commitment. Our 2023 budget includes $2.6 billion in foreign assistance programs that promote gender equity and equality worldwide, more than doubling the amount that we have previously attributed to gender efforts during the previous year. So USAID just launched our new gender equality and women's empowerment policy, which provides our vision to advancing gender equality and women's empowerment, and includes essentially 4 key objectives that USAID, okay, I guess I'm not speaking loud enough, that USAID will advance through investments in all sectors in which we work. So the first is to close the gender gaps that continue to persist, including access to resources, land, information, finance, mobile phones, and so much more. The second is to eliminate gender-based violence and mitigate the harmful effects of GBV on individuals and communities. The third is to increase the capabilities of women and girls to exercise their rights, taking on key leadership roles, influencing decision-making in households, communities, societies, and really helping to shape their own lives. And then fourth is to address the root causes of gender inequality through structural change. So I would just note that the launch of FAO's report that Lauren just talked about was really critical in helping us continue the momentum in the US, and was an opportunity for us to kind of reflect on and refine our portfolio and our priorities. So it was kind of a driving force and factor. And as you pointed out, Lauren, I think in the past decade, there's been little progress towards closing the critical gender gaps that women face across the agri-food systems. Really inequities that continue to hold women back at all levels and in roles across the agri-food systems. So just would note the FAO's robust set of recommendations, what needs to be done to achieve the change that we seek, not just for women and girls, but really for all people and communities and countries, was exciting to consider when we were having our discussions within the US government, and led to some key takeaways for us. So the first was to look beyond the symptoms of inequality across sectors, and really the need to dig in and challenge and essentially change the discriminatory norms and rules so often that underpin and perpetuate many of these gaps. So appreciating that we can't really solve some of these greatest challenges, including global food security and hunger that we've gathered to talk about on progress this week without such transformational change. So maybe just to fast forward a little bit, our USAID gender policy not only defined a policy for USAID, but it also expanded our budget commitments, as I mentioned, through a new initiative that we call Generating Resilience and Opportunities for Women. And because we love our acronyms, we call it GROW. So through the US government's Feed the Future initiative, that's an interagency, US government interagency initiative led by USAID. USAID, the GROW initiative will help in a number of priorities areas. So GROW will increase women producers' productivity and resilience to shocks. I can talk a little bit more about that. But the second priority of GROW is to support women to really fully participate in and benefit from far more diversified and climate resilient economic opportunities in all parts of food and water systems. And I would just note for an example, because I was just in Mozambique last week and had a chance to hear about some of our programs, of which GROW is part, that's under GROW. GROW will accelerate support to women-owned formal and informal small and medium enterprises by facilitating and helping to facilitate access to some of the financial, social, and knowledge capital and digital services linking to regional and global markets. And I saw that firsthand in a lot of our programming and how that was happening, particularly in rural areas in Mozambique through one of our programs called Premier. And so this is just a little bit of an example of some of the things that we're doing. But GROW's third priority will help drive the humanitarian system to prioritize addressing the unique needs of women and girls affected by climate and food security crisis. And I mentioned that because I think, Brenda, you were saying in the introduction, I've sort of navigated between humanitarian development throughout my career. And it's critical that all of these sectors, regardless of whatever agencies we are in, really tackle some of these issues. So I just want to say that this vision really builds on commitments we made at the UN Food Systems Summit a couple of years ago, which at that time included talking about support to what you had mentioned, Jemima, about the Global Food 50/50 report, also committing to continue to advance some of our groundbreaking work on gender metrics, including the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index. So that's supported and supporting work in the Gender Data Hub. So that's been really important with our work with IFPRI. And part of that has included pilots in Bangladesh and Malawi, working with national partners to develop some of the national gender data hubs, which meet some of their need with important learning. So just to say that there's a number of things that have driven some of our work and some of our vision as a US government over the past year. And based on some of the findings, which was a good motivator for us of the FAO report. Many, I think, of the countries represented at the summit +2 this week were at the May Agriculture Innovation Mission for Climate. So the Aim4C summit that USAID's leadership and partnership with the ministers of agriculture from Canada, Honduras, the CGIAR made a call to action for more investments that benefit women's empowerment and gender equality. So just, it's important that we keep this momentum collectively at whatever the different conferences and events and meetings and dialogues that we have, whether in the field or at some of the capitals. I mean, I think specifically at that event, we had called for greater investment in innovations that include women to address their specific preferences and their specific needs. So all that to say, ultimately, we know that policy plays a critical role in enabling or constraining women's success in food systems. I think a theme that's come up this week in some of the different panel discussions. And with this in mind, we've also helped support a gender responsive agricultural systems policy fellowship, which if anyone has questions, happy to chat more about that. And I want to conclude because I realize that we're probably running a little bit out of time, that I think it is important to note that we're at a pivotal moment where we are now. So through evidence that our global food system will not be more productive, more resilient, and more equitable unless women have the resources and the opportunities to take equal part in the transformation of those systems. So I think this room can probably all agree to that. Thanks again. And I think that we, as Lauren and others had noted, the FAO report highlighted that slim progress was made over the last decade. And that should really be a wake-up call to all of us that we can do better. And we must take action to help change the trajectory so that we can see progress for all that we hope to over the next decade. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Mia, for your really strong words. And I think, taking that idea that this is in fact a pivotal moment and that we don't have a lot of excuses for not doing something about this with all of the knowledge and the evidence that we have. Really excited about USAID's new policy and seeing it really come through in all of the approaches that you're taking. And in particular, I'd love to talk to you about the humanitarian aspects, but also to see the backing, the budget backing, which is really important to translate this into action. So we will go to actually our final panelist who we have online, Ms. Rima, and I think we've got her on the screen. I can't see behind me. No, that's me. Okay, I think we're getting her. Yes, there we are. Rima, that's you. Over to you, please.
Thank you so much. And I really appreciate bringing the voices of the informal sector women workers into the room. I also have some of my sisters sitting right there in person. I can see them as well. And I will bring the reality on the ground. So I will speak here on behalf of our 2.5 million women workers in the informal economy. Majority of these women are engaged in the food system in one way or the other. In fact, they are the backbone of the informal sector workers' families. And in addition to shouldering the responsibility of fulfilling the family's food and nutritional needs, they contribute towards completing the circular economy of the food systems. These women workers play a major role in production of agri-inputs, as well as in agriculture, food processing, in trading of food, in making decisions about consumption and purchase of food at the household level, as well as in the recycling of the food waste, both at the household level and also at the dump sites in the large cities. And yet, these women workers hardly have any voice or visibility in the food system. And SEWA has been working on several initiatives to put into action some of the discussions that we have had so far on the panel, but also during the UN Food System Summit dialogues. And I would like to share here some of the learnings from the same discussions, which would bring the women workers in the food systems up into the value chain or into the center, and how it helps in increasing the bargaining power of the women workers. The entire food value chain has to have a women-centered or a human-centered approach to work. The value chains which are owned and managed by the women, so that, right from the seed banks, fertilizer banks, women-owned and managed agro-processing and food processing centers, as well as women managing the marketing of the produce. So the first lesson I would like to share is organizing is the key, as Lauren mentioned in her report as well. And our 5 decades of experience shows that organizing helps build the collective strength and bargaining power of the women. But organizing is a slow process. It has to be at the pace of the women workers, and therefore it needs investment of both time and resources. Organizing at national, regional, and global levels will enable cross-country knowledge and experience sharing and bring visibility and voice to workers in the policy arena. The effectiveness of this work is done in collaboration with the Asia Farmers Association, the National Farmers Forum Network, which is promoted both by FAO and IFPRI. The second is that organizing women, important lesson is organizing women into their own supply chains and into their own economic enterprises. And on these lines, I would like to share here an experience of our agribusiness enterprise, a for-profit agribusiness company owned and managed by over 250,000 small and marginal farmers and agriculture workers. The supply chain has its own procurement channels, processing centers, and a cadre of grassroots saleswomen. The brand is Rudy. And it ensures fair returns to the farmers, decent and dignified employment opportunities for landless laborers, women workers, and food and nutrition security at the household level. Let me invite one of my sisters who is sitting there, Kailash Kuvarben, to speak her own experience, and then I will conclude. Kailash Ben, please.
नमस्ते, मेरा नाम कैलाश कुंवर, मैं डूंगरपुर जिले से हूँ, राजस्थान से हूँ और मैं एक राजपूत की बेटी हूँ और राजपूत हूँ। और हमें क्या है कि राजपूत में घर से बाहर नहीं निकलने दिया जाता था, लेकिन मैं 13 साल से सेवा में जुड़ी हूँ और मैं हमारी एक छोटी सी खेती है और खेती है, लेकिन इसमें हमें बहुत हमारी छोटी सी खेती है, लेकिन इसमें से हमारे पानी और ये पर्यावरण प्रदूषण में बहुत झटके आ रहे थे, तो उससे हमें बहुत दिक्कत आ रही थी, खेती नहीं कर पा रहे थे। फिर हम सेवा से जुड़े, सेवा ने हमें पर्यावरण और कम पानी में खेती करने की हमें माहिती दी और इससे हम झटके और जब झटके सामने आते थे तो उसका निवारण निकला। फिर हम उसके हिसाब से हम खेती कर पाए, सोयाबीन है, बाजरा है, ज्वार है, इस प्रकार की हमने खेती की। ताकि खेती तो कर ली, लेकिन इसके लिए हमें मार्केट नहीं मिल रहा था और उसके लिए मार्केट लिंकेजिंग जरूरी था। तो उसके लिए हमारी सेवा से हमें तालीम दी रूडी सेंटर की कि रूडी में किस प्रकार से अपन मार्केट लिंकेज कर सकेंगे यूं करके। फिर रूडी में एक हमारी कंपनी की रूडी की और रूडी की कंपनी बना करके हमने छोटे से छोटे किसानों की खरीदारी, हम उनके खेतों में जा करके खरीदारी करके हमारे सेंटर पे लाते, सेंटर पे ला करके प्रोसेसिंग करके ग्रेडिंग करके उसको हम गांवों में ले जाते। हमारी छोटी बहनें हैं, वो गांव में जाके सेल भी करती हैं और इसके किसानों ने अच्छे से दाम भी मिलता किसानों को, क्योंकि वो बड़े किसान थे, उनके साथ संपर्क नहीं कर रहे थे, हम छोटे किसानों से संपर्क कर रहे थे, उनको अच्छा दाम मिलने लगा, वो आत्मनिर्भर बनने लगे और उसके हिसाब से हम आमदनी भी बढ़ी और यंत्र तंत्र के हिसाब से हमने एक रूडी पिछले साल में हमने 10 करोड़ का सेलिंग किया, टर्नओवर किया 10 करोड़ का और सेवा 10 करोड़ का टर्नओवर किया और मैं सेवा को खूब आभार करना चाहती हूँ। और मेरे को तो रोजगारी मिली, लेकिन मेरे जैसी दूसरी बहनों को भी मिले और जय सेवा जय भारत।
Thank you, Kailash Ben. And so therefore, I would like to conclude here by saying 2 points that Rudy, the company owned by women like Kailash Kuvar Ben, is an example of local decentralized agro supply chain, which cuts down the distance between the producer and the consumer, thereby reducing the climate impact, provides farmers with technical trainings and technology-related inputs, and also enables them to transition to clean, green, and regenerative agriculture practices, and provides direct market accesses. As a result, it also motivates the small farmers to also bring back forgotten foods into cultivation. And therefore, we also now have a subsidiary. So the most important learning that is, I would summarize, is the need for building an economy of nurturance. The failure of the current food system and the current economic models also leads to this alternative decentralized supply chains, which shows that it brings a human-centered approach and is based on local production and local consumption. It will address the issue of poverty, bring in digital technology at the grassroots level, preserve and motivate the rural youth to also take charge in the food system and regenerate the local economy. And in the end, I would also like to say that, you know, I'm so excited to learn about GROW from USAID. I would urge that we look at how do we invest in building resilience of women-owned enterprises like that of Kailash Kuvarban and scaling up these enterprises. If we can look at some kind of financing instruments that would really help in strengthening role of women in agro-food systems. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Rima and Kailash. Really great that you could also join us here in person, and very inspiring, I think, to hear also about these initiatives, Rudy in particular, and the ability to have both support for climate resilient agriculture, but also these connections to markets, and as a result, these dignified livelihoods. So very impressive. We would like now to give the word to Donald Brown, who is the Assistant Vice President of the Program Management Division from IFPRI. So Donald, over to you.
Thank you, and greetings to everyone, and thanks to the panel, and also for those really interesting reports. I thought maybe I'd just give a few comments from IFPRI's perspective, but also because it's something that's also very close to my own heart. Maybe the first thing is, I'm not sure equality is enough, actually. I think we probably need to go beyond equality. We need to tip the balance the other way. So we probably need inequality with far more presence of women. I think so, tipping the balance. I think key words I heard today were transformation and transformational. I think intentional. I really wanted to kind of emphasize that word intentional. It's got to go way beyond sort of box ticking or what sounds right to actually being intentional. And I think probably it's not just morally right, but it's also, we are not going to transform any food system without doing this. IFPRI has been very committed for a number of years on gender equality and women's empowerment. And we've worked at transforming and mainstreaming the approaches, and particularly trying to transform gendered power dynamics. I think as much through addressing the informal structural constraints as the formal ones. And I think much of what I heard today resonates from the reports. And one way we've tried to do it is around this intentional, is to actually have some concrete targets and actually monitor and report against them. So we have a number of targets. We have targets on ensuring that 35% of the designs are validated as designed to transform gender norms and relations. I'm glad to see that we're actually at 53%. And I'm glad to see that 94% of the projects currently are actually rated as moderately satisfactory or better. One interesting result from our own impact assessments that are independent around gender equality and women's empowerment is that we've seen for the projects closing in the last 2 or 3 years that 27% more decision-making power is with women through the projects than in the comparison households. And that's mainly driven by increasing the amount of resources on which women actually can make decisions on. And I think, you know, as a very practical basis, ensuring their ability to participate in decision-making is at least a necessary first step. But one of the challenges we face as a financing organization is that we need to continue to support project teams and to build the capacity of many of our partners to really be able to address the issues. And that in itself is quite a challenge because very often the capacity is quite low. There's very specific tools needed, which need training, which really need deeper understanding. And governments do not want to borrow for the softer skills. They don't want to borrow, you know, and particularly in this economic environment now, they want to borrow for hard infrastructure. So a challenge we face is where do we get those resources to really push this agenda alongside the investments that governments are borrowing on for EFAB projects. And I think this applies to others. So I think there's a question to everyone there. If we really want to do this, we really do need those flexible grant resources that will really help. And then just lastly, going forward, I mean, clearly we need to stay focused. Clearly we need to make sure we're focused on transformation and it's an intentional priority. And we need targets and we need to track those. But I would, and obviously the other thing about taking things to scale, but I would really like, and I think as the last speaker said, I would really like to bring us back to the fact that we really need to create space to listen to voices. You know, it's not all about reports, it's not all about data, but it's actually about being informed and inspired by individual women, rural women, female farmers, female entrepreneurs, local women's groups. And I really appreciated the one perspective we heard just now, because actually we need to also understand their views that go beyond data, but also respect the diversity of individual women and their challenges they face, but also the diversity of what their own ambitions are. So I'd just like to sort of say yes, yes, yes to all the things that we tend to do in a kind of in an institutional level, but let's not just lose that anchor on the voices of the people concerned. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Donald, for your call there. I think equality is indeed not enough. And not only do we need space for those voices, but we need them at the table as decision makers. We actually do have a few minutes for one or two questions. I can only take them from the floor here, unfortunately, not from remote. My colleague here at the end.
Thank you so much. My name is Nitya Rao, and I'm a member of the Scientific Advisory Group to the UN Food Systems Coordination Hub, and I've worked for many years in the field of gender and rural development. And thanks very much for all the interventions. And I just wanted to actually pick up, perhaps this is for Rima, who's online, if she's still online, and Jemima. I think, you know, from Rima's perspective, there has been a lot of mobilization, organization, and collective strength and bargaining power and agency on the ground. I think the global 50-50 that you presented was very much at a global level in terms of women's participation. And actually, it gives a very sad picture of lack of voice at the top level. So I think that there are these scales. And while the global is very much dominant, I'm just wondering that how do we put these stories actually together in terms of moving forward, that perhaps we do need to look at this analysis of representation and participation of women across different scales. And related to that, I think it should not just be calling in women to hear their voices, but I think they need to have a right to be on the table at different levels. Thank you so much.
Thanks for that. Jemima, Rima, do you want to have a response while we see if there are other questions? Go ahead, Jemima.
Not a perfect response, but to say that you're completely right, that we do need representation of local voices in the global space, because one of the things that I keep saying is, if we believe that women are good enough to produce, to process, to cook the food. They should also be good enough to make the decisions that affect food systems. And I think that should be the underlying principle here. So we need representation, not just us listening to them, as you say, very lightly, Nitya, but they are actually part of the decision making. They are part of, you know, putting the priorities that we need to advance on the table. And we really need to think through what the governance, and we had that as a thread in the food systems summit, what the governance of food systems is and where the voices of those who are most in the food system, where those voices are, and really be intentional about how we do that in the global space, but also how we bring voices like Siwa into that decision-making processes, including on where finance is going. We've been talking about the means of implementation and the finance that's needed. We need to critically think about where is that finance gonna go? Who's going to make decisions about what gets prioritized in terms of action? So a big question, a big agenda, but we all really must be part of this in making sure that we are everybody that needs to be in that decision-making set is there, in ways that are meaningful, in ways that are not tokenistic, in ways that they are actually driving some of the agenda. So not a perfect question, but it's really food for thought in terms of how we do this better than we currently are.
Brenda, can I come in for a minute before you
Yes,
take
please
another?
do.
Oh, thank you so much. And I really am so grateful, Nitya Ben, for bringing this question, because when Jemima spoke and when Donald also spoke, I was just asking myself, how do we do that? So how do we bring more voices of the actual women farmers, actual women workers on the decision-making table? And when our friend from USAID was saying, I think I would urge that we really work on bringing out mechanisms for trickling down the finances to the women-owned enterprises. Everything stops at a macro and an SME level, but we really now need to think of how do we go to the micro and level as well. So I would really think that, you know, we do need a round of discussion on that. But I would also like to thank Stephanos and Laura for at least bringing a few women farmers into the discussions that are happening now. Thank you so much. And also to Brenda and WFP.
Thank you, Rima. And I think we hear a little bit a thread of a discussion that perhaps we need to flesh out in a later stage around this issue about financing for this and how that translates down to the people. We unfortunately do not have any more time for questions. We're on a tight schedule, so I'm just going to turn over. It's a pleasure and an honor to be able to turn over to Madam Maria Elena, as you like. Would you like to come up, perhaps? Who is the Deputy Director General of FAO for some closing remarks. Welcome.
Thank you, and good morning, good afternoon to all. And it's really a pleasure to be here and to close this event and maybe to share with you some thoughts that what I listened today. But let me start by thanking all our presenters. I think it has been a very engaging discussion. Thank Brenda for facilitating this event. And also thank you to our colleagues in the United Nations Food System Coordination Hub and the Coalition for Making Food System Work for Women and Girls for organizing this important event. I think to have this event to discuss about gender in agri-food system transformation is important, because the women normally as the one left behind, and it has been shown that we need to do a lot to be fully part of the transformation of our agri-food system. And we talk also about evidence. We have two reports that were shared, and the two reports show that we have inequality. we have making some very, very slowly progress, and a lot has to be done. And one of the reasons is not the reason, but maybe the behind this, we have also imbalanced structures. And it has been said that our structure doesn't show the proportion of women. It has been said that we need to give voice to women. Women need to be in the decision table. I tend to say that it's not only to be in the decision table, it's to be able to make the point and to defend our viewpoint. I just can share with you some example. We are working with women to be part on the negotiation of climate change. We have very few women leading a delegation. We reached 30%, but they spoke for 10%. The numbers doesn't show how much we are able to express our needs, to be able to be part of the decision making. And I think is how we can build the capacity. And this is also an important point, to be reflected in the structure, I fully agree, but to be able to have a voice on those structure. And our report launched by FAO, the status of women in agri-food system, shows that gender inequalities continue to affect millions of women engaged in agri-food system around the world. We have the norms presenting the barriers, we have the lack of knowledge, the lack to access to land, to resources, to networks, to finance and technology. All of those are the impediments for us to really have to reach a gender balance. But I think the positive is that we have solutions and that we have that can help have a more promising future and prosperous future. The examples we learn from USAID today in this generating resilience and opportunities for women. And I think the work, the incredible work we are doing is a lesson learned, is an example how we can build and bring more women. The examples we have on women on value chains, how we can improve local production, local consumption, how we can regenerate the local economy and have more empower and more livelihoods to women. But I also agree that we need financing, as it has been said by my colleague, how we can improve access to finance. It's not to have finance, it's to have access to finance and to address the root causes of those structural problems and we need to change the structure, we need to change the behavior, and we need better transition. And also it has been said that we need to create space. And to me, those spaces also to talk about success stories. We have a lot of women with stories, how we can share and amplify those stories, how we can also share what didn't work well and how it can be changes, and how we can work collectively to amplify those messages and those stories. I think from what I heard and what we have from the reports, maybe let me take some takeaways, share with some takeaways. The importance to leverage data and evidence to develop strategies to close the gender gap and to tackle the structural cause of inequalities in agri-food system. We know the problems, we know what to be done, we need to do, and we need to do at scale. It has been some of the colleagues said, we need to magnify the solution at scale in order that we can achieve tangible changes in gender equality and women empowerment. And as it has been said, we need to go beyond the household. We need to reach the communities. We need to reach the market. We need to reach the policy spheres. And this is really where we can make the changes. And we need to work on how we can overcome the discriminatory norms and barriers. It's slow, it's very difficult to do because it has to do with tradition, with culture, but it can be done. I used to share an example when I start working in FAO. I start in Niger. I don't know if you know Niger, but it's the country where the population growth in the world is the biggest. And we, at the UN, we went to the parliament to discuss with the members of the parliament about the issue. And we were kicked out of the parliament to say, this is what God decided. You cannot talk to us about this. And 1 year ago, the president was talking about this issue. It took maybe 10, 15 years, but we cannot give up. We need to continue this journey. It's only through joint efforts that we can change those barriers and we can change those norms. In FAO, I can say that we are fully committed, my colleagues in the ESP division, but all of us in the leadership to really work to transform agri-food system, to bring gender equality, to be aware that women can make this transformation, but to bring all the tools we need to make it happen. With this, I would say that thank you again for being today. Let's keep this journey. Then when we go to the stock taking in 2 years from now, we have a lot of success stories to share and to say it was good what we have done, and we will be all proud, all of us proud as women, as men that supported us, that we make this journey valuable and we don't regret what we have started together. Thank you.